Rick.
Hi.
So really keen to hear a bit more and talk a bit more about what you think the future of policing is going to look like in Britain. I know that we've spoken quite a bit about it in the past, and based on that, I think my first question is around what you think some of the key challenges are for the police, particularly in recent years, about public confidence and trust.
Yeah, well, I think that's the biggest challenge the police face at the moment. I think is around trust and confidence. All the data seems to show that, firstly, confidence has been falling for a while, and then more latterly, trust appears to have fallen as well, and that's really significant because the British policing model is supposed to be a model of policing by consent, and so the idea is that the police do their work with the support of the public. And, there's a number of things going on here. Some of it is about, obviously, all of the recent appalling scandals in the Met, which have raised questions about whether people can trust the police, because we've had examples of police officers committing serious crimes, behaving in a really unprofessional way, and having an organisational culture which Louise Casey found to be discriminatory. So there's some big issues around that. There's also, I think, some issues for the public around the service they're getting from the police and the fact that they don't feel that it's maybe as good as it used to be, particularly the proportion of crimes that are getting reported that lead to any kind of sort of positive outcome or result for the victim has fallen by a lot in the last few years. We've also seen things like response times getting longer. Police visibility in communities has declined as well. So I think all of this is, some of that's to do with austerity, some of it's to do with the more complex nature of the work, which means they have less time maybe to dedicate to those kind of bread and butter things that the public are used to expecting from the police. And then on top of that, you've had all these issues around conduct and ethics as well. So all of that, I think, is become a bit of a perfect storm in terms of trust and confidence.
Yeah, because that's really interesting. A lot of our data kind of shows similar themes around what could be driving that. And I mean, one of the things that's coming out is, which you kind of touched on tangentially there, is around how it might vary by different groups in the population, particularly the findings of Baroness Casey's review into the Met. But I wonder whether you had insight into that, because particularly there's obviously ethnic minority groups and accusations of certain police officers and racism, but also, to your point, around certain crimes not leading to prosecution. I'm thinking particularly around sexual crimes and rape.
Yeah, I mean, there's different groups in society experience policing differently, and there isn't just this one thing called the general public which has the same experience. There's lots of different experiences of policing, and the experience of black communities with the police has, for a very long time, been very, very problematic, and long histories of police racism, of unfair treatment, of disproportionate treatment, which, if you look at almost any example of the police use of power, then if you're a black person, you're massively disproportionately likely to be subject to the use of police power. That remains a huge problem, and it is indeed, particularly people of Black Caribbean heritage, who have the least confidence in the police of anybody in Britain. So that's a really significant issue. And then also, obviously, the appalling murder of Sarah Everard highlighted, I think has made a lot of women feel differently about the police, and has put into question whether the police can be trusted, and has highlighted misogyny and sexism within policing. We've seen lots of cases of police officers who've been latterly found guilty of domestic abuse, sexual crime. Louise Casey found that police officers who've been accused of domestic abuse, basically that not being taken seriously by their organisation, essentially it being kind of covered up and so on. And so there's been a kind of corruption there in terms of the way that's been dealt with in the Met. So I think that has led to a widening breach between the police and how they're perceived by women. And so, and on top of that as well, just this long-standing concern about how seriously policing and the criminal justice system have taken violence against women and girls, and whether that's been sufficiently prioritised. It's more prioritised than it was 20 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago, sexual crime and domestic abuse were not at the kind of centre of police work. They now very much, I think, are at the sort of centre of police work, certainly in terms of, if you look at the work of investigators, those types of cases are a large component of the caseload now, because women in particular are much more likely to come forward and report than they used to. But at the same time, the outcomes are still terrible. I mean, the success rate in terms of rape investigations is, less than 1% of rapes reported to police lead to a conviction. So, which is just an appalling state of affairs. So yeah, I think that all of that has raised big issues about misogyny, about rape, about sexism, and about how seriously policing takes violence against women and girls.
Yeah, because that's really interesting. Because as you know, one of the things that we'd looked at for this recent poll is around what the public perceive police priorities to be versus what they think police priorities should be. And sexual crime and domestic abuse was considered to be of lower priority for the police by the public. So 44% of the public were saying that sexual crime and rape should be prioritised, whereas only 20% thought the police currently do prioritise it. So there's kind of this gap there, this perception gap, perhaps, in terms of where police time is really going versus what the public really perceive. And one of the things that we've also talked about, and which is really interesting, is around how the public often say, kind of, no matter how you ask them, what do you think, what do you expect from the police, what do you want from the police, visible policing often comes up. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, but also whether you think there are other kind of perception gaps between the public and what kind of is the reality for police.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of perception gaps. I mean, I think frankly, most members of the public, and I don't mean this in a patronising way. I mean, because I'd be the same if I didn't work on policing. I wouldn't know much about what the police do either. I don't think the public do know that much about the kind of work that the police do. Most members of the public don't have much contact with the police. I mean, it's only a small minority of the public who have contact with the police in any 1 year. Obviously, there are some people who have repeated contact with the police, but that's a small group within the population. So there's so I think there's a lot of, so I think the public, I think what the public think the police do reflects what they see in the media and in popular culture, so I think, for example, if you look at any sort of detective series on the television, you will see a sort of, one detective and a whole team of people working on one homicide. And I think people sort of think that's how it works. Whereas in fact, most of investigative work in the police, most of it's not homicide, and a lot of it's much more, if you like, mundane than that. And you'll have one detective with 30 cases on the go at the same time and sort of struggling to get through them. So it's almost the opposite of what the media portrayal is. And of course, and it also creates this sense that what the police always deal with is crime, that that's the predominant thing that the police are dealing with, whereas in fact crime is only a minority of the calls which come through to the police. Some debate about exactly how much it is, but the reality is that a lot of what the police do and have always done is not crime related. Dealing with mental health incidents, looking for missing persons, and so on. So there's antisocial behaviour. I mean, lots of things which aren't crime. So there's lots of perception gaps, I think, about policing, and probably quite a distorted view of what the police do as a result of that. And on visibility, I think, it's very clear that the public want visibility. They want visible policing. And that then leads to the question, well, are they right to want it in terms of the evidence? What does the evidence show? And actually, the evidence is sort of there is a case for visibility if you look at the evidence, and certainly in terms of improving the public sense of confidence, they seem that the two, confidence and visibility and seeing the police out and about, that seems to raise levels of public confidence in the police. It also appears to have some effect on people's sort of sense of security and fear of crime. And there's also some evidence that if you concentrate police officers in high crime areas, then it can have a deterrent effect on crime. So that there's a study from Western Australia which shows that if the police patrol a high crime area for 15 minutes every 5 days, then crime falls by quite a lot. And I think that's called hotspots policing. And it's this idea that, in an area where there isn't that much policing, if you increase, if you like, the dosage of policing, then it does create some kind of deterrent effect that people think, the police are around here, maybe I won't do what I was going to do. So there is actually a case for visibility, but it does have to be targeted, I think, at areas of high crime areas where it's needed most.
Yeah. And because I also want to pick up a point that in the Police Foundation's kind of strategic review of policing, you mention around how the police are kind of the public service of last resort. So they're kind of the safety net once other services have failed. And kind of thinking towards the future, how do you see the police working with other services at the moment, and how do you think that might change? Particularly, I'm thinking about the Met Police's kind of announcement earlier this year that they would no longer handle mental health calls.
Well, I think everybody agrees, or almost everybody agrees, that basically the police have ended up, that it's not a satisfactory position to be in, where the police are basically the emergency service for dealing with mental health crisis. That the police aren't trained to do that. They're not, that's not where their focus should be. And that people who are in mental health crisis need to be cared for ultimately by the health system rather than by the criminal justice system. So it's not an ideal state of affairs to have the police spending so much time dealing with that. I mean, I was in A&E not that long ago, and about what I reckon would be about half of a response shift in the town where I live was sitting in A&E trying to get people booked in and assess people who clearly were in mental health distress. So I mean that would be true if you went into A&E anywhere in the country. That would be true. You'll often see police officers in there waiting while people with mental health problems are waiting to be assessed. That takes up a huge amount of police time. I don't think it's what the public want the police to be doing. It's not what the police want to be doing. Now, is it right to just sort of say on an arbitrary date, we're going to stop doing that? No, I don't think that is the right approach. You do have to work in partnership. And in Humberside, where they did this, they developed a partnership between the NHS, local government, the police, to try to make sure that the right people were getting to people when they were needed. There will always be a need for the police to be involved in cases like that, but it's but you've got to, but it ought to be when there's an absolutely real need for police, for the powers that the police have to be present. And so, where there's a risk of very serious harm, or or where it's connected to crime, that's where the police need to be deployed. Otherwise, they should really be dealt with by the NHS. But that needs planning, and it needs local coordination to understand who's going to go to what. Because what you don't want to do is to leave people, leave cracks that people can fall between. So all of this for me is about real local collaboration. And in this case, it does mean the NHS taking on more of the responsibility for people in mental health crisis.
Yeah, because the other thing that you kind of note in the review is obviously the police have quite a lot of expectations for the future, not just from the public, but from other quarters, from PCCs, from mayors, from the national government, the Home Office. How do you see these kind of expectations, requirements sometimes from these different quarters complementing each other or even working against each other, contradicting each other for the police? How do you see that? How do you think that is for the police, and how can they navigate that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're at the centre of a quite complex system of accountability and governance, which means that there'll always be a strong local interest in policing. There'll always be a strong national interest in policing. It's one of those services where that's always the case. So I think it's absolutely right that most of the priorities in terms of local crime, local policing are set locally by the Police and Crime Commissioner, elected by the public. I think that it's right that those priorities are set at that level. You don't want the Home Office setting priorities for sort of burglary and, basically local crime. Equally, I think it's important that the Home Office does set some expectations on police forces about other things they need to do, which aren't local or are not prioritised locally. And that would include things like their role in counter-terrorism, their role in tackling serious and organised crime, their role in, fraud, for example, which is the largest crime type affecting people in England and Wales. We don't really respond to it very effectively at all as a country, and the police response is pretty poor. And I think it's important that at a national level we set expectations. I mean, fraud will never be prioritised locally, so if you want to get to grips with it, you have to set some clear expectations nationally. So there's always going to be chief constable are always going to have to be at the centre of lots of different demands on them, and they're going to have to work out what should they prioritise. And I think there are maybe things we can do to simplify that accountability system, to sort of clarify some of the roles and responsibilities, and I think we should do that. But at the end, the police are going to have to chart a course through often quite conflicting demands, and I think that's what they need to do. And I think that's why it's really important for them to have a clear sense of purpose and mission, and to sort of and to hold true to that, and of course adapt it to what elected politicians are requesting at different points in time, but to have a sense of this is what we're here for, this is our job, and this is where we're going, because otherwise they can just get knocked around all the time between conflicting demands. The inspectorate says we need to do this, the government says we need to do that, the PCC says they want to do this. In the end, they have to sort of take that on board and have a clear sense of mission that comes out of it. So I think I acknowledge it's not easy, but I think some of that is just an inevitable part of operating in quite a complex environment.
My final question is hopefully leaving on a more positive note around what makes you optimistic about the future of policing? What does good look like for you?
Well, I think there's always ground for hope and optimism. I don't think we need to, and one of the reasons for that is that at its heart, the model of policing that Peel developed in the 19th century, this policing by consent model, it still stands. I mean, I think in terms of the theory and the aspiration, the aspiration is we want a form of policing which serves the public rather than oppresses the public, which is there to help people rather than to just enforce the law. And of course the police will always have to do enforcement. Of course they'll always get into conflicts with people, but in the end, that public service orientation, that policing by consent model, that enforcement as a last resort rather than a first resort, that I think is absolutely the right way to do policing. And And do our police always live up to that? No. But the thing that gives me optimism is that they still do to a large extent hold themselves to that test. I think they still aspire to it. And that's one of the reasons why British policing is looked to as a model around the world. We're by and large, thank goodness, an unarmed police service, only got 140,000 police officers, only 5,000 of them carry guns. That's really rare and it's quite precious. So there's a lot in our policing model that we can take heart from. And I think it's about saying, you have to constantly hold yourself to that standard and say, are we living up to that aspiration of that form of policing? And that should be the test. And so the fact that, that model is, quite culturally ingrained and is the basis of our system, I think gives me hope that, despite all of the very real challenges we've got at the moment, the police in this country still do aspire to be better, and they still do aspire to a model of policing, which, I think in the end is about getting, the right balance between, order and liberty. That's basically what it's about. Can we get a decent balance between the need to maintain order and, but to do that in a free society? And that, doing that is an art, not a science. But I think our police service, for all its faults, still does hold itself to that test. And there are lots of people. The other thing that gives me optimism is there are lots of people going into policing every year who really want to do it for the right reasons, who really want to do it to serve the public. They're not doing it as a power kick. They're not doing it just because they want to drive around in fast cars and kick doors in. They're doing it because they want to serve the public. And sometimes that involves kicking doors in and driving around in fast cars, but they're doing it because of their public service orientation. And many of them do very brave things every day. All of that also gives me, cause for hope that we can deal with the current problems and that we can come out of it in 5-10 years' time with a police service that does command the trust and confidence of the public.
Oh, thank you, Rick Muir of the Police Foundation. Really appreciate your time.
That's okay. Thank you.